Welcome to the New School for Social Research. It's wonderful to have you all here. Very grateful that you were able to make it. Sorry? Ah, okay. So, this is, of course, the conference on anti-colonialism and its afterlives and renewing and rethinking the debate. And several years ago, one of the most important scholarly debates, which you can recall, was whether modern democracy required foundations or not. And at the time, I thought not. I'm now convinced it does. It would have been impossible financially to get this going, this conference, without the generosity of the Dean of the New School, the Zolberg Institute, the Janey Program, the University Senate, Student Senate, the Department of Sociology and Politics at NSSR, and we are especially grateful to the New York branch of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, especially Mariana Fernandez. None of us would be here today without the countless hours of work that Udeepta Chakravarty, Jochen, Schmon, and Luis Miner donated to the conference. Foundations matter, but so does labor. And so continuing with labor, I want to list the persons that have worked very hard and long and oftentimes behind the scenes to get this going. Seth Cohen, Jocelyn Montero, Gabe Florio, Jose Gomez, Maeve Kari Kozlak, Charles Whitcroft, Sherry Cohen of all of the New School. We're also grateful to Anabela Dallinger for designing promotional materials for the event and for Julián Gómez-Delgado for recording the event. Now, let me take another minute to remind you of the conference's intellectual agenda so that we can have that in the back of our minds as we go through the day. According to some scholars, the various traditions of criticizing colonial modernity in the human sciences, rather than just literary criticism, and these tendencies would include postcolonial, decolonial, settler colonial, and anti-imperial, are now spent. We disagree. Certain approaches and themes associated with these fields, to be sure, have been rendered anachronistic by ongoing sociopolitical transformations that have taken place within and across the countries of the peripheral fringe and the metropolitan core. Some of these changes, and I list them, include, for example, neoliberal globalization, mass migration, proliferation of ethno-racial enclaves, camps for stateless peoples, spread of populism, and so on. All of these have blurred the boundaries between them. Others have been ossified by interdisciplinary academic debates, and still others by ideologically monistic perspectives. Without ignoring or belittling these criticisms that have been leveled against counter-colonial traditions by critics and sympathizers alike, this conference seeks to rethink and renew them by having them engage with and transform each other's understanding of the current and untimely aspects of the receding present. We aim to broaden the intellectual and political criticism of anti-colonial modernity by exploring from divergent perspectives the following issues or themes: popular politics, Marxism, Palestine-Israel war, abolitionism, migration, and ecology. And the roundtable includes speakers who have made significant contributions to the tradition of anti-colonial criticism broadly understood. There are two announcements that I'd like to make at this moment. The first one is that on the panel on ecology, which is today, Saturday, from 5 to 7, will be at the University Center, which is where the student encampment is housed, and that's where we'll be holding that particular panel. And the second panel on Sunday that will also be held there is the one on Palestine and Israel, and that's from 1:30 to 3:30. And it's just a short walk, and we'll try and go together so nobody gets lost. The other note that I want to remind you of is that we have invited quite a few colleagues from Columbia University, and they've all agreed to come, but the situation there is very complex, tense, and in flux. One colleague has already communicated to us that they cannot come. And so, but the others will be coming. The panel on, regrettably, the panel on Israel-Palestine, Nadia El Abu El-Jah, who would be speaking on anti-colonial politics in the shadow of Gaza, definitely will not be attending. But fortunately, we have Dirk Moses to be here to, who will be speaking on genocide and anti-colonial concept in Israel-Palestine. And with that, I turn over the floor to our first panel.
So, can you all hear me now? Yes. Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out so early this morning. I'm very, very happy to introduce the first panel that we have this morning with, on my left, Radhika Mongia and Nandita Sharma on my right. So we'll start with Nandita. Nandita is an activist scholar whose research is shaped by the social movements she is active in, including the borders movements and those struggling for planetary commons. She's a professor at the University of Hawaii in Manoa, and she's the author of 7 books, Home Economics, Nationalism and the Making of Migrant Workers in Canada, as well as her most recent Home Rule, National Sovereignty and the Separation of Natives and Migrants from 2020. On my left is again Radhika, whose research interests include feminist, Marxist, and postcolonial theory, political and historical sociology, as well as the study of transnational and global processes. Specifically, her work explores issues of migration, citizenship, and state formation. She's a professor at York University in Toronto. Her book that came out in 2018 is called Indian Migration and Empire, a Colonial Genealogy of the Modern State. And forthcoming is Citizenship, Deprivation, Legality, Democracy, and the Everyday. So we will start with Nandita, and I will do the presentation for you right there, right?
And we changed things all the time.
Okay.
I'm going to stand.
Okay, all right.
Thank you. Okay, so can you hear me?
Yes.
The capitalist world system of nation states is the afterlife of anti-colonialism. Its central binary is that of citizen-migrant. The state category of migrant has come to stand in for both the racial other and the global poor, whose movement into national territories is to be restricted and regulated. Anti-immigration politics are essential for the legitimacy of every nation state and one of the main animating forces for violence in the world today. This violence is, for the most part, considered perfectly reasonable, natural even, and increasingly demanded. This was not inevitable. Instead, it is the result of the nationalist domination of anti-colonial movements. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, nationalists ascended to the mainstream of anti-colonial movements. In doing so, they displaced other anti-colonial struggles. These are many, and their histories are not as storied as those of quote-unquote national liberation movements. In the early days of anti-colonial movements across the world, the main demand was the return of the commons. Not only in the English countryside, the birthplace of capitalist social relations, but everywhere, people well understood the relationship between freedom and access to one's means of subsistence. They knew that capitalism required the destruction of their means of a free life. Likewise, maroon societies in the New World, formed from the motley crews of colonized natives, runaway black slaves, and indentured white servants, demanded their commons. Later examples of non- or even anti-nationalist versions of anti-colonialism are evident. For example, Frederick Cooper, a historian of the French Empire, has noted that the anti-colonial efforts of railroad workers in French African colonies were for wage parity with their co-French subjects in European France, rather than national sovereignty. In the early days, of the success of 20th century communist movements, nationalism had not yet defined their revolutionary aims, but they certainly succumbed very quickly, and indeed it can be said that they had already been tainted by nationalist ideologies. By Stalin's 1924 turnaround on the issue of world revolution, when he declared that USSR policy should pivot on the idea of realizing, quote, socialism in one country, unquote, the game was up, and the USSR was reimagined as a plurinational state with, of course, the dominant one in control. The wide-scale acceptance of nation-states as a solution to colonialism is how we got to the mess that we're in today. Yet, the link between our multiple overlapping present crises and the violence of the nationalist afterlife of anti-colonialism is rarely acknowledged, even as we live in a world whose political organization in no way corresponds with the way we live our lives or what we need to do to resolve these crises. Our way out is hindered by the weakness of anti-nationalist counter-movements. Indeed, nationalist demands, wow, you're so good, thank you. Nationalist demands for sovereignty remain central to the dominant understanding of not only anti-colonial struggles, but the very idea of justice. This is true at the formal level of world politics, where national sovereignty is the ideological foundation of the international political order. It is also true at the everyday level of thought and action. The belief that each of us is part of one or another nation remains, quote, the most universally legitimate value in the political life of our time, as Ben Anderson noted way back in 1983. The political demand that each of these nations must be sovereign over its territories for justice to be realized also reigns supreme and is testimony to the capture of our political imaginations by nationalism. This is, of course, enormously consequential for the organization of one of the most important bases for inequality and justification for violence in the world today, the legal and legitimated subordination and political demonization of migrantized people. National sovereignty is not only an enormously popular demand, it is also the international legal basis for the regulation and restriction of the movement of people whose nationality doesn't correspond to the state they seek to enter, live, and work in. National sovereignty is also the basis for the full realization of the state category of migrant. I say full because the antecedents of the migrant can be traced to a time when nation states did not yet exist, the 1830s and 1840s, when the British Empire was seeking new ways to control and discipline labor after it was forced to abolish slavery, as Radhika has written brilliantly about. It was only with the institutionalization of the national form of state sovereignty and the related normalization of nationalisms that the state category and figure of migrant became both globally actionable and, after World War II, globally hegemonic. With astonishing speed, after World War II, the near global space of imperial states was mostly nationalized. Between 1945 and 1960 alone, 36 new nation states in Asia and Africa were granted either a restricted autonomy or outright independence from empires. By the 1960s, the two most powerful imperial states that entered World War II, the British and the French, lost the vast majority of their empires and nationalized the sovereignty of their imperial metropoles in Europe. Each former colony and former metropole marked their newfound national sovereignty by implementing citizenship and immigration laws. Shortly after the end of World War II, and certainly by the end of the 1960s, the imperial form of state sovereignty was made politically illegitimate to be replaced by the universal hegemony of the national form. Nearly every person on Earth was assigned the nationality of one or another nation state, and nearly every inch of our shared planet was governed by one or another national sovereign. Through the process of nationalizing state sovereignty, the former metropoles and former colonies together built what I've called a post-colonial New World Order. comprised of nation-state sovereignty, international financial and governance bodies, and the expanded global circulation of capital. Actions taken by the United States played an important, albeit understudied, part in the making of post-colonialism. Having started the nationalization of its own state sovereignty in 1875 when it passed the Page Act, its first federal immigration controls, the U.S. helped to end imperial rule and establish the global rule of nation-states. Shortly before the end of World War I, U.S. President Wilson's, what's going on here? Sorry, I'm missing a slide there. Already after World War I, U.S. President Wilson's doctrine of self-rule had been enshrined in the League of Nations. At that time, however, empires successfully prevented this doctrine from applying to most people in their colonies. Empires were willing to reimagine their metropoles as national societies, but they well knew that extending such a status to their colonies would result in the collapse of imperial rule. By 1941, however, with metropolitan France under Nazi occupation, the slides are mixed up, sorry. With metropolitan France under Nazi occupation and the British metropole under siege, Britain was desperate for U.S. help in fighting the Axis powers. The United States seized the opportunity to demand a reorganization of the still largely imperial world to its advantage. That year, 1941, President Roosevelt succeeded in having Prime Minister Churchill accept the extension of the Wilsonian doctrine of self-rule to the natives in its colonies. Their agreement was sealed in the 1941 Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter was far from an expression of solidarity with the colonized on the part of the United States. The U.S. could not have been any less interested in giving up expropriated land, including the lands comprising U.S. national territory, or ending the exploitation of people's labor. Neither would it countenance the creation of a world without hierarchies of worth and disparities in wealth, power, and peace. Instead, the United States understood that imperial state monopolies over their colonies prevented capitalists based in the U.S. from exploiting these same territories and the people in them. Empires simply stood in the way of the United States becoming a world hegemon. The basis of U.S. support for expanding the principle of national self-determination to the colonies was the understanding that it would gain from the opening of relatively closed imperial markets for land, labor, and commodities. Such an opening would be achieved by the transformation of both imperial metropoles and colonies into quote-unquote independent sovereign nation states, each enmeshed in an international regime of financial, political, and military ties. In short, as one of the world's first nation states, the U.S. wanted to universalize the nation-state form to seize the markets previously monopolized by imperial states. The U.S., as we know, was wildly successful. My slides are mixed up, sorry. The universal principle of self-rule agreed to in the 1941 Atlantic Charter formed the basis for the first major international political institution of post-colonialism, the United Nations, a name coined by Roosevelt during World War II. In its 1945 founding charter, the UN enshrined the recognition of the right of national self-determination, or the right of national sovereignty for those people who could successfully claim to be a nation as the bedrock of international law. Yet in no place on earth were all the people living in a place considered to be part of the nation, claiming sovereignty over territory and all life on it. Indeed, hostility to migrants was bred in the bone of the United Nations Charter. With its declaration of the rights of nations to self-determination, it would not account for the rights of all those people who were not the people of the nation. Those regarded as non-members of the nation were remade into foreigners and more so into migrants, the new category of nation-state power. They were minoritized and made the people out of place, in contrast to the supposedly self-determinate people of a place, according to ideas of national territorial sovereignty. Nation-making was always a violent process. The founding of many a national liberation state, to use Vijay Prasad's term, as well as nation-states formed from the metropoles of European empires, were marked by a flurry of deportations, population transfers, partitions, and genocides. In addition, each used new immigration regulations and restrictions to fashion the nation the state purported to represent. Immigration controls allowed nation states to organize the constitutive outside that it defined itself against, all those other people from other nations who had their own national homeland elsewhere and should either stay there or go back to them. Yet nowhere did the actual practices that anti-colonial movements were fighting against, theft of land, theft of the wealth of the labor of working people, the denigration of the colonized, end. Indeed, each of these intensified. More land was taken by developing nation states, and more labor was exploited in the bid to improve gross national product. As the U.S. had anticipated, the national form of state power gave rise to new post-colonial methods for the global accumulation of capital and new institutions organizing it. The post-colonial New World Order was organized around international institutions, starting with those agreed to at the UN's 1944 Monetary and Financial Conference at Bretton Woods, the IMF, the World Bank, and somewhat later the GATT, which was reorganized as the WTO in 1995. Together, they oversaw an enormous and rapid expansion of capitalist social relations and the resultant proletarianization of more and more people across the world. With post-colonialism, the power of both capital and now nationalized states grew enormously. Within nation states and across the global system of nation states, disparities in wealth, power, and peace are even greater today than during the era of empires. Writing in 2004, Samir Amin noted that there was an increase in the inequality between peoples within nation states from a maximum ratio of 2 to 1 around 1800 to 60 to 1 today. At a global scale, Branko Milanovic noted that in the mid-19th century, the real income of workers in most countries was similar and low. Much of the inequality between people in the world was a result of the differences in income between capitalists and workers. Today, the wage gap between unskilled workers, quote unquote, in rich and poor countries often differ by a factor of 10 to 1. As graphed here, Milanovic concludes that almost 3/4 of global inequality is due to one's national citizenship. Indeed, he argues that today one's national citizenship is the greatest predictor of life's outcomes. Immigration regulations and restrictions keep the system of differentiated rights in place. As the political geography of today's world of rich world states and poor world states largely mirrors the world of imperial metropoles and colonies, Nadine El-Anani has argued in the British context that immigration law in rich world nation states, quote, is the tool that ensures that dispossessed people have no claim over what was stolen from them, unquote. Despite the strong through line of imperial theft in the operation of today's nation states and their immigration laws, dominant ideas of colonization do not regard migrants as agents in anti-colonial movements. Self-described Hawaiian nationalist Haunani K. Trask puts it this way, quote, defending Hawaiian sovereignty initiatives is only beneficial when non-natives play the roles assigned to them by natives. Hawaiian poet Imai Kalani Kalahele put it more succinctly in his poem Huli, quote, if your help If to help us is your wish, then stand behind us, not to the side and not in front. Migrants, now represented as non-natives, cannot be seen as agents of anti-colonialism because of the strong association of colonialism with foreignness. Colonization continues to be largely defined as the foreign usurpation of the land of those who are native to it. It is these natives who are the subjects and agents of anti-colonialism. The bifurcation of natives and migrants is a consequence of a false dichotomy between land and labor. This is especially true in the colonies of the New World, the Americas, Caribbean, Oceania, where the loss of life of those people living there prior to European colonialism was quick and immense. As a result, for imperial ventures to be secure and profitable, imperial states moved large numbers of workers to labor under brutal conditions, which of course also caused an enormous loss of life. The people moved through these systems, prison transport, transatlantic slavery, coolieism, and others, are not regarded as colonial subjects, but at best as exploited workers and at worst settler colonizers. Such a bifurcated view of colonialism and labor exploitation is central to the work of Patrick Wolfe, an historian of settler colonialism, although one in which he has erased the significance of whiteness to such projects. Wolfe contends that the project of settler colonialism simply has a different elementary logic than other colonial projects do, what he terms a, quote, logic of elimination versus a logic of labor exploitation. However, such dualities not only erase the long and brutal history of exploiting the labor of those categorized as the natives of the New World, it also fails to deal with the deep relationship between expropriation and exploitation. European colonizers did not go to the New World with a fully formed plan to eliminate the people they first encountered there. Indeed, the exploitation of native labor in the New World was just as crucial to the colonial project there as it was anywhere else. The enslavement of natives started with the very first landing of Columbus in the Caribbean. Columbus recognized that, quote, the Indians of Hispaniola were and are the greatest wealth of the island because they are the ones who dig and harvest and collect the bread and other supplies and gather the gold from the mines and do all the work of men and beasts alike, unquote. Indeed, in the Americas, the exploitation of Indian slaves, estimated to number anywhere from 2.5 to 5 million people, was not, as Andrés Reséndez argues, quote, a residue of colonial wars or a transitional phase until African slaves arrived in the New World in sufficient numbers, but was an established network with staying power in which a host of individuals, from imperial bureaucrats down to miners, governors, frontier captains, and Indian allies, had a stake. Indeed, Indian slavery lasted well into the late 19th century. Thus, far from being a pre-planned and unique structure of settler colonialism, as Patrick Wolfe maintains, the violent death of many millions of natives was the result of the imperial project to take territory and exploit the labor of natives in order to extract wealth. Indeed, the rapid death of people in the American colonies due to disease was precipitated, Reséndez shows, by their being forced to do hard labor for the colonizers. The privileging of land expropriation over labor exploitation in the colonization of the Americas not only fails to recognize the exploited labor of natives, it also fails to account for the experience of land loss by those deemed to be foreign workers. Yet, no one whose labor is made exploitable has not already been expropriated from the land. The inability to recognize this is due to how the space of colonialism is understood. Again, the imperial state's definition appears to be accepted. Each of its colonies is seen as a wholly separate entity, unbound from other colonies or the metropole. This is an abstraction of land into territory and the essentialization of native peoples' relationship to it. Such approaches are evident in self-identified Asian settler colonist Candice Fujikane's assertion that, quote, indigenous people are differentiated from settlers by their genealogical familial relationship with specific land bases that are ancestors to them. One is either indigenous to a particular land base or one is not. Asian Americans are undeniably settlers in the United States because we cannot claim any genealogy to the land we occupy, no matter how many lifetimes Asian settlers work on the land or how many Asian immigrants have been killed through racist persecution and hate crimes, or how brutal the political or colonial regimes that occasioned Asians' exodus from their homelands, unquote. In other words, natives are colonized while other people of color in the United States are victims of racism, thus marking another false dichotomy between colonialism and racism. Yet, the labor procurement systems that brought people to the Americas as prison transport, transatlantic slavery, or the coolie system of contracted indenture operated within an imperial space and were organized, financed, and protected by imperial states. Indeed, most often, the circuit of transportation and exploitation was arranged entirely within the space of an imperial state's rule. To not see them and the subsequent generations born and laboring in the colonies as colonized, instead to see them as aliens, which is how they were defined by the British Empire, is to accept the categorical logic of imperial states. Indeed, to think of natives, another state category, as the only colonized people in the Americas is to accept the epistemological framework of colonial modernity, including the imperial association of particular colonies with those defined as natives to it. As these inform our understandings of colonialism and therefore anti-colonialism, no room is left for people imagined as non-natives in projects of anti-colonialism. This is not an accident. Racialization, gendering, and the territorialization of identity were key technologies organizing a division of labor, as well as the differential allocation of mercy and terror. The state categories of native, European, black, and yellow, as well as subject, alien, and later migrant, are their products. Yet these differentially categorized people lived and worked together in a shared imperial space. To have a practice of anti-colonialism capacious enough to include natives, criminalized workers from Europe, enslaved black people, people indentured as coolie labor from Asia, and those people now categorized from around the world as migrants, requires that we rethink what we mean by colonization. We need a view that decenters foreignness and disrupts the binary of native and foreigner to include all people who have been expropriated from the land so that their labor power can be exploited for the profit of the owners of capital. This is important because in expanding the scope of what we know as colonialism, we simultaneously expand the space of anti-colonialism. We are, of course, very far from realizing this in practice. Today, we witness an ever more popular discourse that natives and migrants are wholly separate people, forever locked in an antagonistic relationship with one another. As I discussed, not only in Hawaii, but across the world and across the left-right political spectrum, migrants are increasingly represented as settlers, colonizers, or invaders, disrupting the lives of the natives of national societies. As anti-immigrant politics intensify and nationalisms harden, the imperial state category of native has come roaring back into politics. This is interesting since most colonized people are now national citizens of states who supposedly act in their name. Those who remain colonized also imagine themselves as members of national sovereigns in waiting. It may therefore seem somewhat odd that the idea of nativeness is quickly coming to dominate ideas of nationness. It may be stranger still that many people who see themselves as either European or white, the precise categories that once designated them as the superior counterparts of the colonized natives, also have come to imagine themselves as natives. However, since the latter part of the 20th century, claims to nativeness, autochthony or indigeneity, have become a well-established feature of life in nation states. Today's natives are also portrayed as engaged in anti-colonial struggles. It is not just the figure of the native, but that of the national native, which has emerged as at the center of new anti-colonial politics. The new foreigner to be vanquished is often the figure of the migrant. We can readily see the employment of discourses of nativeness against migrants across the world. On the African continent, where the sovereignty of former colonies has mostly been nationalized, battles rage over who is native and therefore sovereign over any particular territory. In Asia, too, the politics of autochthony are also the basis of enormous violence, including genocide. In the rich world, there are two discourses of national nativeness. In the United States and Canada, for example, descendants of enslaved Africans or indentured workers from Asia, along with all contemporary migrants, have been recast as settler colonists. Here, the dropping of the white in white settler colonialism takes place alongside efforts to cull the membership rolls of various native nations. The Mohawks and Cherokees have been engaged in two widely publicized efforts in this regard. In Europe, heads of state, popular political parties, and white supremacist movements have declared that migrants are colonizing the, quote, indigenous peoples of Europe, unquote. Relatedly, in the nation states formed from the previous British white dominions, long-standing claims that Europeans improved the land, quote unquote, and made it productive, equally claim native status on the basis that they are the first civilized people on the territory. Each of these instances of autochthonous discourse represents an expansion of the definition of colonizer and a further limiting of the criteria for national membership. While some migrants have been able to become national citizens, something that is increasingly difficult to do, it is nearly impossible for migrants to become national natives. And I'm just going to conclude with my last paragraph. It is important to recognize that the employment of autochthonous discourses is structurally organized by the conditions of the post-colonial New World Order. Not only is being a member of a nation the prerequisite for self-determination, seeing oneself as colonized allows one to believe that foreigners are the reason nationalisms and nation states have utterly failed to deliver on their promises of anti-colonialism, community, equality, etc., and a world order where the member of the family of nations is equal to each other. I'll end it there. Thank you. Maybe I can close this.
Yes, I can do that.
Whatever you want.
Is this on? Doesn't work? No,
I don't know.
It is.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay. It's always a pleasure to be on a panel with Nandita. As you'll see, there's many resonances between our work and also many divergences. Before I get into my paper, my sincere thanks to the conference organizers, Carlos, Luis, Udeepta, and Jochen. I'm so sorry, I've been struggling with the pronunciation of your name all morning. So I'm just going to get right into my paper. In our current moment, it appears that talk of postcolonialism is on the wane, while that of decolonization is on the rise. While we should be wary of a venture that has been embraced by university administrators, I am nonetheless framing my talk in terms of decolonization. In the academy, the project of decolonizing knowledge has been understood in at least three ways that, to my mind, all fit under the broad umbrella of Eurocentrism. First, there are those who champion knowledge protocols that value indigenous epistemologies systematically undervalued by Eurocentric frameworks. As one example of the many we might cite here, think of the work of someone like Walter Mignolo. Second are the calls to produce analytical frameworks that can more accurately speak to non-European settings. Again, there are many examples, but we can think here of Dipesh Chakravarty's Provincializing Europe, or Adam Gatashu and Karuna Mantena's recent essay, Anti-Colonialism and the Decolonization of Political Theory. Lastly, there are approaches that historicize the Europe-other dichotomy to focus attention on their co-production and relationality. I note that the terms co-production and relationality should not be taken to signify parity or symmetry, but rather dense entanglements that are often productive of inequality. I think Nandita's work is a good example of this, as is, for instance, the work of Adam McEwen, his book, Melancholy Order, Asian Migration and the Globalization of Borders. I would also situate my own work on the relations between migration, colonialism, and state formation in this camp. While, to my mind, there is much of value in these three approaches, I want to flag my deep discomfort, indeed rejection of, work that claims the mantle of anti-colonial or decolonial critique in the service of regressive political agendas by appeals to authenticity. And we can talk about that. We can talk about everything in the Q&A. Though I have more to say on general and more conceptual matters related to anti-colonialism and its afterlives, the remit of this conference, since I'm on a panel on migration, I'm going to turn my attention to this topic. Is it working? I feel like it's not. Does that one work?
It's about the microphone. It's actually just the back one.
Okay. Well,
you just have to get it as close as possible.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm
sorry.
No. There's, okay, so in my talk today, is that better? Okay. Okay, in my talk today, I wish to question the common assumption that controlling migration is a persistent and inviolable feature of state sovereignty that can be dated to at least the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia. In opposition to this assumption, I demonstrate how the regulation of colonial migrations was central to producing a state monopoly over migration control. Moreover, state sovereignty, as embodying such authority, does not date to Westphalia, but to the early 20th century. Next, I turn to some contemporary transformations in migration and related regimes to show how currently we are witnessing a profound refashioning of borders, of citizens, and of migrants through novel spatial and temporal maneuvers. These practices are evident across the world, and I invite you to think with me if the resultant formations might be usefully understood as the generalization of colonial power. That, crudely defined, indicates not only the pervasive presence of coercion and force, but also the persistent recourse to instituting and institutionalizing differentiated legal regimes and political subjectivities. I largely draw on my own earlier work on colonial Indian migration and some of my current work on contemporary transformations in citizenship regimes in India. I should note that this is a very telescoped and synoptic and crude elaboration of things, and I'll be happy to speak to all of this further in the Q&A. Let me turn first to 19th and early 20th century formations of sovereignty. Until recently, most scholarship on the historical formation of migration regimes took the view that widespread state control of mobility is a distinctly 20th century phenomena. Two presumptions ground this assessment. First, that the origins of migration regulations lie in Western Europe and white settler colonies. And second, that policies of restriction and prohibition are the defining elements of migration regulation. In other words, that states regulate migration primarily within a logic of constraint. These presumptions inform dominant paradigms of migration theory, which rarely consider patterns of migration in other regions as the empirical material for formulating larger theoretical and analytical frameworks. To counter such positions, I wish to provide a brief analysis of two key moments in state regulation of colonial Indian migration, with particular focus on the notion of state sovereignty. British abolition of plantation slavery in 1834 provided the context for the earliest regulations to monitor colonial Indian migration. Abolition caused planters in Mauritius and the Caribbean to develop schemes for migrant Indian labor to replace emancipated slave labor. The regulations that followed monitored the terms of exit as well as entry. Though historians now refer to this as indentured migration, what preoccupied the state in the wake of slavery abolition was how to ensure that it was free. The demand for freedom and the acrimonious debates it provoked between 1835 and 1842 worked in two distinct and contrasting registers. First were the vociferous objections of abolitionists who saw the planter organized migration schemes as, quote, a new system of slavery. In their view, Indian migration to the former slave colonies required immediate cessation through state intervention. In the second register were equally vociferous objections emanating from the plantocracy that saw state control on both entry and exit as an illegitimate exercise of sovereign power that contravened then prevalent principle and practice of free movement. In their view, any state regulation compromised the fundamental liberty of the subject, exceeded the limits of sovereign authority, and represented, and I'm quoting them here, a tyranny not for a moment to be endured, end quote. If cynical and opportunistic, the planters were in fact correct. There were no ready-made principles that could simply be applied to justify state control of migration, with authorities in England noting, quote, this practice of controlling migration has no foundation in any existing law, end quote. Lacking recourse to a settled principle, how was such control to be justified? Premised on colonial racial thinking, the state argued that Indian natives were especially prone to fraud and duress. State supervision was thus necessary precisely to protect the liberty of the subject and ensure that the migrants were, and I quote again, in the fullest sense of the term, free agents. This warranted a temporary exception to general principles regarding free, unregulated movement and to the reach and limits of sovereign authority. The uniqueness of the circumstances produced a lasting paradox. The state regulated free migration precisely to ensure that it was free. And don't try and make logical sense of it because it doesn't resolve into logic. This paradoxical resolution required immigrants to stage a ritual of consent to a state-authored and state-authorized labor contract prior to departure. And under the aegis of this scheme, approximately 1.3 million Indians moved to some 20 British, French, and Dutch colonies across 4 continents. Before I turn to the second moment I wish to address in these early regulations that change how we understand state sovereignty, and that relate to the early 20th century and the nationalization of migration, there are three additional facets of the debates and ensuing resolutions surrounding Indian indenture I wish to flag. First, the orienting frame, spatial scale, and economic imperatives of these debates that included state, quasi-state, and non-state participants in England, India, Mauritius, and the Caribbean were imperial and not proto-national. With freedom as the chief axis of control, the debates unfolded across a complex field of variegated sovereignties that characterized imperial space. Second, these exceptional state regulations that specified the terms of exit, entry, residence, and potentially of return monitored only the movement of indentured labor to specific destinations. They did not control the far larger migration of Indians not participating in the indenture system. Third, the regulations were directed at meeting the labor demands of the plantocracy and at facilitating, not prohibiting movement, while guarding against charges that indenture was but slavery by another name. State control over migration that explicitly draws on a logic of constraint and prohibition has a different history. It is a history that mobilizes a justificatory discourse of state sovereignty and security in terms more familiar to us today. Within the history of Indian migration regulations, it is only with the movement of non-indentured Indians to white settler colonies like Australia, Canada, South Africa, the US, in the first decades of the 20th century, that we see vigorous demands to extend state control to cover all types of movement. Sorry. The doctors tell me it's something called an essential tremor, which means there's no other symptom for it. It's not a symptom of something else, but I think perhaps it is. My tremor I'm talking about. Okay. So conceiving the space of the settler colony as race-specific, the explicit aim of these demands was to restrict and prohibit the migration on racial grounds. Canada's request in 1906 for such prohibition would result in a protracted 10-year debate that would only be resolved in 1915. The spatial scale and legal parameters of this debate were once again imperial and not national. The official debate on how to restrict the movement of Indians quickly reached an impasse. No principles could be found to justify a prohibition on Indian migration, since at the time, India, like Canada, was part of the British Empire, and Indians, like Canadians, were British subjects. And most importantly, it was, and I quote here, the right of all subjects of His Majesty to transfer themselves from one part of his domains to another, end quote. The eventual solution to restrict Indian migration to Canada followed a proposal initially put forth by Wilfrid Laurier, Prime Minister of Canada in 1907, who suggested the introduction of a system of passports issued selectively to emigrants in India. This is akin to what we now understand as a visa. So only some people get it. The government of British India had consistently objected to this proposal on the grounds that it violated all prevailing policy and that, we will recall, only regulated indentured migration. They had, however, not only supported, but also suggested that Canada devise immigration policy so long as its racist motivations were suitably disguised, a suggestion that Canada, in the absence of other means, would doggedly pursue. Notably absent from these early discussions was a discourse of state sovereignty, its corollary, a discourse of state security, or their articulation to a discourse of nationality. It would take the May 1914 arrival at Vancouver of the ship the Kamagata Maru carrying 376 Indian immigrants in the context of an impending world war that would provide the occasion for activating these discourses in any credible way. Unable to have recourse to an explicitly racial logic, framing the responses at all sites, so India, England, Canada, was the appearance of a discourse of state sovereignty, and more specifically, a discourse of national sovereignty. And here, Nandita and my work resonates a lot. Nationality here was activated as an alibi for race, which was institutionalized in the mechanism of the passport. The modern passport purports to assign a national identity rather than a racial identity, and relies on a unique characteristic of nationality, which, as Benedict Anderson tells us, is simultaneously universal and sui generis. Thus, everyone has a nationality, though each nationality is distinctive. The seemingly neutral category of nationality operates as a proxy for race, and this relation is enduringly encapsulated in the modern passport. Moreover, a robust and detailed examination of this 10-year-long debate reveals how colonial migrations fed into processes, including those of anti-colonial nationalism, that led to the unmaking of the empire state and the formation of the nation state. The consequence, rather than the cause, of such control and such understandings is the historical production of a state as encasing a fixed territory, a fixed population, and of sovereignty conceived in territorialized national terms and embodying the authority to control migration. Walls and fences, thus, that guard national borders are daily erected around the globe. Concurrently, there are newer, less immediately visible forms of bordering underway. These changes represent spatial and temporal recalibrations that profoundly restructure the border, the citizen, and the migrant. Though these spatial and temporal techniques often work in tandem, I consider them in the following section separately, largely for analytical convenience. So let me turn first to some spatial recalibrations in processes of bordering. Over the past 2 decades, several scholars have alerted us to recent changes in practices of bordering and the radically transformed migration regimes we have. In an important study focused on the legal dimensions of these practices, Ayla Sachar offers the notion of the shifting border to capture the spatial aspects of this transformation, where, she writes, the border extends outwards and stretches inward. Sachar suggests that this reconfiguration entails that we, in turn, shift our approaches from, and I'm quoting her here, the more familiar locus of studying the movement of people across borders to critically investigating the movement of borders to regulate the mobility of people, end quote. While Sachar uses the formulation of the Westphalian state as a foil for her argument, and seems to give the trinity of territory, people, authority longer historical functionality than it has, I find her analysis useful due to its elaboration of what she calls portable legal walls that are increasingly being erected. These legal walls can extend outward, what Aristide Zolberg, for whom the center is named, referred to as migration regulation by remote control. So the legal walls can extend outward, stretch inward, and indeed be entirely outsourced. I'm going to quickly provide an example of each of these 3 spatial techniques. The most ordinary and long-standing technique of extending the border outward is visa regimes. But potential migrants or visitors are not scrutinized at the territorial border or its analogs like airports or ports, but at consulates or embassies located elsewhere. More recently, additional pre-clearance and pre-inspection procedures have been added to this modality, a technique mobilized especially by the United States, always the innovator. For example, one undergoes US immigration in Canada before boarding a flight. As Sachar writes, quote, the border has instead been replanted as a legal construct on non-US soil, end quote. There is a benefit to this, I have to tell you, because if you know you're not going to be let in, you kind of don't have to get on the flight, right? Okay. An example of stretching the border internally. In the US, and perhaps many here are aware of this, the border now stretches up to 100 miles inwards. On this definition, given its land and coastal borders, all of New York State is at the border. Expedited removal of those considered barred from entry is permitted at the border, which is a zone in which constitutional provisions don't apply. As the border is now conceived as stretching up to 100 miles inwards, constitutional protections are suspended over a vast territory. And lastly, an example of outsourcing the border. And many of you, again, might be aware of this. The example I'm thinking of is the UK and outsourcing the border to Rwanda, which has very much been in the news these days. So the legislation that the UK House of Commons has just passed will permit asylum seekers to be transported to Rwanda for processing. Even if applicants' asylum claims are accepted, they will not be granted residence in the UK, but will be required to stay on in Rwanda. Some 6 months ago, when they first tried to pass this legislation, the UK Supreme Court found the scheme unlawful, as they were not convinced that Rwanda constituted what's called a safe country. Earlier this week, in fact on Monday, the UK House of Commons redid the legislation that classifies in law Rwanda as a safe country. Let's see what happens. I don't know if it's got to the House of Lords yet. Let's watch. Now I want to get to, so these are some kind of spatial recalibrations in the border. I want to now turn to temporal recalibrations. If in the kinds of cases I've described so far, focused on spatial techniques, one can identify people who move or seek to move, and we can identify putative citizens and foreigners, alongside there's another regime being consolidated that relies on temporal techniques, where people find their legal status change without having moved at all. Frequently relying on the logic of cutoff dates, accompanied by new legal definitions of the citizen, these temporal techniques simultaneously produce citizens, illegal migrants, and stateless people. Such processes are underway in sites as varied as the Dominican Republic, Myanmar, and India. Let me describe in a little more detail how it has unfolded in India, where a largely bureaucratic exercise called the National Register of Citizens, or NRC, has been put in place. The legal basis for conducting the NRC exercise came from a series of changes to the citizenship law between 1986 and 2003 that systematically eroded jus soli, or birthright citizenship, as outlined in the Indian Constitution. After many stops and starts, the NRC was implemented beginning in 2015 and sought to distinguish every resident in the northeastern state of Assam as either a citizen or a non-citizen through a process that required applicants to submit documentary evidence of citizenship. Now, to call this process a National Register of Citizens is a misnomer, as the process has thus far been conducted only in one state, though threats to expand it pan-nationally are constantly issued, especially during election campaigns, as is currently the case, because Indian elections are underway. In Assam, to count as a citizen, people must demonstrate that they or their ancestors are included in either a semi-secret NRC conducted in Assam in 1951, or that they were on the electoral rolls prior to midnight of March 1971, 24th March, I believe, that marks the beginning of the Bangladesh Liberation War. This war ended in December 1971 and saw the formation of Bangladesh, previously East Pakistan. Only documentary evidence can provide proof of citizenship. Some 33 million people submitted applications. It is entirely likely that for a variety of reasons, many did not even attempt the exercise. Of these 33 million, the final NRC, released on 31st August 2019, excludes more than 1.9 million people who have been deemed non-citizens or illegal migrants. We must be aware that a lack of documentation is not ipso facto an indication of a lack of legal status. More so, it might be an indication of socioeconomic marginalization, disproportionately affecting certain groups, such as those who are poor or illiterate, particularly Muslims or Dalits, or members of transgender communities who have fled natal homes, or women who might have married and moved away and have little access to the relevant documents. In addition, the converse is also true. Being in possession of documents is not the verification of a pre-existing legal status, but might be the result of what Kamal Sadiq calls documentary citizenship, whereby people are able, through a variety of means, to assemble a dossier of documents that qualify them as citizens. The NRC claims to be, and is most frequently understood, as simply ascertaining citizenship, or as a tool, however flawed, of verification. However, it is better understood as a technique that simultaneously produces both citizens and non-citizens and gives them a new materiality they previously did not have. The NRC exercise in Assam required all persons to provide proof of citizenship through lineage and proof of residence, preferably, as I noted already, stretching back 70 years to 1951, or at least 50 years to 1971. Frankly, given this high bar, in some ways it's surprising that only 1.9 million people were excluded from the final tabulation. Along with epithets of illegal migrants, infiltrators, and Bangladeshis, the term Bangladeshi is also deployed as a slur to refer to those deemed non-citizens. So the question arises, are these people Bangladeshi? As Talha Rahman observes, the finding, accurate or otherwise, that a person is not a citizen of India does not imply that India can accord the person a different citizenship. India has repeatedly assured Bangladesh that the NRC is an internal exercise. Bangladesh, for its part, has maintained that those deemed non-citizens in India are not Bangladeshi nationals. Thus, those not included in the NRC are rendered stateless and potentially confront lives in perpetual detention, where deportation is not an option because you don't know where to deport them to. India is not a signatory to the Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness, and consequently, it's under no legal obligation to adhere to the convention. We often sound the alarm of danger with discriminatory laws, for instance, around surveillance, that might apply to non-citizens in a given jurisdiction, noting that it's only a matter of time before they will apply to citizens. Many citizens ignore such alarms, seeing citizenship as a cloak of protection and being unconcerned with the fate of non-citizens. But what we see with the NRC in Assam and with its projected implementation across India is that everyone is a non-citizen unless and until they affirmatively prove otherwise. Everyone is required to provide proof of legal belonging. Everyone is a suspect, a potential infiltrator, unless they can furnish documents to the contrary. Reversing in a certain way a key premise of the common law tradition, here everyone is guilty until proven innocent. In other words, the NRC operates in and has produced a field of generalized criminality. Despite the generalized criminality, the effect of the NRC is that the burden of proof falls differently on different bodies. namely that all Muslim bodies are rendered perennially suspect. And there's much more to be said on that. The possible outcome of such suspicion is that one could end up in indefinite detention with deportation not an option. In grotesque preparation, just last year, a massive new detention center the size of 7 football fields began operations in the Golpara district of Assam. And I'm concluding. Now, though I'm thinking about these matters for my new project in terms of what migration scholars call citizenship revocation or citizenship deprivation, crimmigration, and incarceration, I want to return by way of conclusion to the invitation I made at the beginning of my talk, namely to consider if such new formations can be usefully characterized as the generalization of colonial power. Regardless of the locale or the kind of colonial formation under study, there is wide agreement among scholars that the distinguishing feature of the colonial state are not only the pervasive presence of coercion and force, but also the persistent recourse to instituting and institutionalizing differentiated legal regimes and political subjectivities. If over the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the polity in the metropole would, in different measure and with different degrees of success, come to be seen as constituted by formally equal and equivalent citizens, the polity in the colony was riven by multiple stratified distinctions between the colonizer and the colonized. Whether colonialism proceeded via direct or indirect rule, in both iterations of colonial rule, which frequently operated in conjunction, not only was the colony governed in ways distinct from the metropole, additionally, metropolitan subjects in the colony were treated differentially. To my mind, on this understanding of colonial power, there is perhaps a case to be made that today all states embody a colonial dimension, with the citizen-migrant distinction as one of the primary axes of differentiation. As we survey the new practices of bordering and the emergence of new migration regimes in both the global north and the global south, in Europe, in white settler colonies, and in sites deemed to be the post-colonies, what we witness in our current moment is a generalization of this form of power. To confront this generalization of colonial power, our notions of decolonization will need substantial expansion and will, moreover, need to be accompanied by decolonization, not only in academic knowledge protocols, but in the material practices that organize our world. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you so much, both of you. We have now, oh, this one is not working. Okay, can you hear me now? Does it work? Yes. You take it for the audience. So we have around half an hour now for Q&A. We have a microphone here that Udeepta will carry around. So please, I think we should collect some questions first. So maybe go with the first 3 questions. So please raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll note you down. Jack, right is your name? And who else? Connor in the back. And the third person there, what is your name? Ivan? Ivan. Okay, so then we start with Jack.
Great. Well, thank you so much for both of your presentations. I had a question for Radhika. So I was very interested in this discussion of, like in the Canadian case, the sort of shift in the justification for the state control of migration, going from like one of racial exclusion to one of state sovereignty, right? But I was sort of wondering, like in the way you've presented this, is this just made for pragmatic reasons? Like, from what I understand, you know, the British Colonial Office doesn't want a colour bar that doesn't make a distinction between British subjects and non-British subjects. But I mean, prior to 1907, that functionally exists in Natal, it functionally exists in Australia, right? Even if it's not in the law, they're not hiding it, right? They're saying, you know, this is a whites-only country. So like, why do you think this shift happens?
Thank you. Thank you both so much for your talk. Also, just a question for Professor Mongia. I wonder if you could comment on sort of the rise of digital and biometric technologies for proving or producing subjectivity and how that fits into this framework of kind of burden of proof on certain bodies and you know the context of a generalized form of coloniality.
Hello, I'm thinking about Europe specifically. I'm thinking about the Schengen zone and how there's free movement throughout Europe, but at the same time, there's increasing border enforcement to and from Europe as a continent, and what that does politically in the continent, how that changes people's subjectivity.
We go first with that round, right? And then,
Okay.
yeah. So.
Connor, is that your, no? Jack, okay. Connor's the next person, okay. So you're completely right that these kinds of techniques were being put in place across a variety of white settler colonies, from Australia to Natal to Canada. But here's the thing about the British Empire and indeed the French Empire. Even though they were hierarchically organized, their premise was a liberal premise. The premise was equality. Okay? So the point of colonialism was precisely, this is the developmentalist narrative, the civilizing mission of colonialism, was that you just need a period of schooling and preparation to become sort of equal subjects, but you are potentially equal subjects. Okay? So in the 19th century, they were able to regulate indenture by saying that the period of schooling, so to speak, and I'm thinking of Uday Mehta's work here, his book Liberalism and Empire, that there hadn't been sufficient schooling, so the logic was this was a necessarily ignorant class of persons, okay? And therefore they needed protection by the state to ensure their freedom. By the 20th century, so a century later, British Indian subjects had also fully internalized this notion of equality. So you had a lot of revolutionary anti-colonial movements, some of which, and those are the ones that Nandita describes, how the more revolutionary aspects of these movements were evacuated and the conservative ones kind of won out. So it was very important in law you could not distinguish between British subjects, right? So you see the breakup of the empire state occurring in numerous registers, one of which is empire. And nationality, the correspondence is just fascinating. You have to see how they suddenly hit upon this. So for 10 years, they're like, there's nothing we can do. And then after the ship arrives there, they're like, JFC, we have to figure out some way to address this. And suddenly this idea of nationality, it's a completely ad hoc justification. But now totally standardized in a passport whose design is also standardized, right? So it's a very interesting moment of the nationalization of migration regimes, where nationality is acting as a proxy for race. I don't know if that addresses your question. In terms of digital technology, sure, and again here, if we just think of the quintessential signifier of mobility these days, the passport. If you look at passports from 50 years ago, they are totally different from the ones today. And the digital technologies, biometric information, all of these, techniques of surveillance are morphing day by day, I like the book, the edited volume by John Torpy and I forget her first name, but Karen Kaplan, maybe, on documenting individual identity, so sort of going from tattoos to biometrics and everything in between. Thank you. Do you want to take the Schengen question, Nandita?
Okay. I just wanted to add something about the shift to national sovereignty and immigration controls and the explicit racialization of criterias for entry. Like, what's interesting is the United States' first immigration law is 1875, the Page Act, that had two categories of exclusion. And the next one that is more well known is the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. So I think it is very interesting to compare the United States with British colonies that were enacting similar legislation, but much later, right? The difference that national sovereignty made to the ability to have racist exclusions to admittance criteria occurred much earlier in the Americas, right? Peru actually was one of the first in, I believe it was 1853, with an explicit exclusion of Chinese people, right? So I think that that's an interesting comparison. Like if you go outside of the British Empire and you look at the Americas, the nationalizing of sovereignty happens much earlier and the explicit racist exclusions happen much earlier. But in terms of Schengen, I'm not exactly sure what the question is. I heard like, how does Schengen, which is the free mobility zone within the European Union, right? If you're a national of a European Union state, then you ostensibly have free mobility within that zone, the Schengen zone, and how it shapes people's subjectivities. I don't think it's a coincidence that nationalism has hardened very severely in Europe after the formation of the European Union. And this Schengen zone of free mobility, right? Like precisely because Schengen created a different sense of the border amongst, being the nation states along, particularly the southern and eastern borders. Well, I guess even the western borders with Spain and Portugal, right? It just created a much harder line around Europe. And led to these ideas like of the indigenous people of Europe, right? Which a lot of far-right parties across Europe mobilized, right? I first heard of it with the British National Party in the 1980s. They were using that, but now it's kind of part of the far-right discourse in Europe is about protecting the indigenous people of Europe. And I do think that that is a result of the formation of the European Union, right? It re-enlivened Europeanness as the basis of rights, particularly mobility rights, versus, and what's happening in Europe is an intensification of the denial of citizenship to people, right? Like it's getting harder and harder to change your status from migrant to citizen within the European Union as well. And we're, what we're seeing in the case of Britain, which is no longer in the European Union, in terms of even the deportation of citizens, right? And the increasing practice of rendering people stateless. So I think that the other aspect of Schengen and subjectivity is, of course, Etienne Balibar has pointed this out, where the idea of Schengen and the European Union also precipitated an imagination that allowed people to understand that there is another world possible outside of national border controls, right? So no borders movements for this reason arose in Europe, right? With that imagination of like, oh, there used to be these border controls here. As a member of a EU state, I no longer have to be governed by them, and I have this free mobility, and that enlivened an imagination of like, why can't everyone have this, right? Why are we preventing people from the rest of the world from moving freely? So I do think that it runs both ways. I don't think that the EU intended for the rise of a no borders movement, but that was one of the consequences as well.
So we go for the next round of questions. I saw Vanessa's hand up, Ida, right? And Andreas.
Hi. Well, thank you very much. It was very enlightening. One of my questions was related to something that I didn't hear you mention, and it's the extreme violence. There's a Mexican anthropologist, Mariela Varela, who talks about the microgovernmentality of migration. In Mexico, in the last 6 years, we had 6 massacres of migrants, and so it's another extreme forms of control. Something that's very interesting that is happening is that the relatives of migrants that have been massacred are organizing and are denouncing this microgovernmentality. One of them, Dolores Suazo, have talked publicly about a genocide of the poor migrants that is happening in front of us and that people mentioned. The last massacre took place last week, and it's not even in the news. So I wanted Nandita to talk more specifically about the issues going on with these migrants. How did you see these extreme violent measures in relation with the forms of control that you mentioned before? Thank you.
Thank you so much for this great panel, 2 really great talks. The question is also directed to Nandita. I really love your work, and while I was hearing your talk, I was also thinking of how many also anti-colonial revolutionaries, I think, had a lot of that, like worked through a lot of that already, right? If we think of how Eric Williams in Capitalism and Slavery shows very clearly that the kind of settler native dichotomy, but also the black slave, non-black slave, binary dichotomy is way too simplistic when we understand how capitalism forcefully moves people all the time, right? In its various modalities and projects of super exploitation. And then just if we think of some of the major anti-colonial works, for instance, Franz Fanon, we also see this wrestling or working through the national question. And I'm sometimes then wondering, okay, is it then a kind of ambivalence that generation had to work through, while also knowing at the same time that there were also strong anti-nationalist, anti-imperialist positions, if we think of Rosa Luxemburg, for instance, right, who actually really made clear already that national independence does not necessarily close the way for class struggle, but actually hinders it. And I'm wondering, knowing that there was so much ambivalence around it already, even with regards to many of the anti-colonial revolutionaries and also politics, as well as knowing that many migrant justice struggles, like I'm usually based in Europe, and they are often considered and also claimed to be anti-colonial struggles. And I think there are also historical examples for this. You raised some, but also the whole notion around political blackness in the UK, for instance, I think always also transports that a bit, but also current migrant justice movements in Europe. So my question is really like, why is this so persistent? Do you think the problem is one of dominant ideology, or is the problem one of kind of, sometimes I'm also wondering, specifically also now in this moment, if it's also a kind of political tactic, because there's no kind of stronger third way that actually goes beyond the question of national liberation. So I was wondering in terms of how do you see, knowing that's a pitfall, and maybe not just a pitfall, but really a failure of liberation. Why do you think is it so persistent that kind of counter movements cling to the nation in that way?
I also have one question, I think. One question, I think, for both of you, and also one suggestion for both of you. The first is, since I understood not only the first, but also the second presentation as a kind of critique of the post-colonial order and of post-colonialism in general and the failure of the anti-colonial movements, do you think there was another path not taken, available? Maybe a federal vision, something that could have broken this statocentric nationalist paradigm that dominated? And if there was, what was that and why it failed and how it failed? And also, since it's about migration and I'm working now with the Bolsheviks, I discovered that migration was a center theme of the Bolsheviks and in relation also to anti-colonial struggles. So Lenin, Bukharin and many others wrote many essays about migration, imperialism and anti-colonial struggles. So maybe there is something there to look as well. Again, a path not taken, a discourse forgotten.
Thank you for those great questions. And I feel like actually the whole room should be participating in answering them because, they get to so much of the core of the theme of the workshop. In terms of the mass deaths of migrants and the normalization of them, right, so that they're not even news stories any longer, I think it is the kind of tension. I think it's kind of an operating tension of a world of nation states, which is biopolitics for some and necropolitics for others. Right? So it is that constant production of the citizen, right, that is invested in the rights and entitlements that come with being put into that category versus the acceptable deaths of those people who are kept out of that category, right? And Mexico is at the front lines in many ways of U.S. policies to extend the border, to extend the U.S. border further south, right? And of course, it's much further south than Mexico at this point. I mean, Todd Miller's written a really fantastic book, The Empire of Borders, that gets into that. So I do think that the death of the migrant is increasingly being made to be necessary for the life of the citizen, right? So this kind of tension of biopolitics for some and necropolitics for others is intensifying and is only going to intensify further, right? Like the US is just trying to sign a deal with Colombia and regarding the Darien Gap, right? Trying to shut down the Darien Gap because it's too dangerous. So what that's going to mean is a further use of the sea for people to move because people aren't going to stop moving, right? So now we're going to see that playing out in the Pacific and Atlantic. So in an interesting way, like this discourse of protection that Radhika points to as, part of the formation of controlling people's movement, right? Like this obvious oxymoron of denying free mobility to protect freedom, right? Is that discourse of protection is still the rationale being used for the acceptance of the death of migrants, right? So we have to stop the smugglers and we have to stop the traffickers to protect the migrant, right? And so all of it is centered around the continued denial of freedom of movement, right? So as long as there's a denial of free movement, the death of the migrant is going to be both inevitable and essential for the life of the citizen, right? So I think what's actually happening in no borders movements today is an increasing emphasis on anti-citizenship, right? Instead of a focus on the migrant and justice for the migrant, it's actually as citizens, we need to engage in a politics of anti-citizenship and reject that dichotomy of bio and necropolitics, right? Vanessa's question, and I love your work, is I I think that Eric Williams and Frantz Fanon were very astute in understanding the limits of a national liberation project and in understanding the limits of a kind of identitarian project within liberation project. But I think where both of them, particularly Eric Williams, kind of fell into the neocolonialism camp, right? Neocolonialism theory. And I think neocolonialism, and this is where Frantz Fanon's critique of the limits of national liberation, right, comes in as well, is I think Fanon, who am I to say, but I think that Fanon didn't quite understand the global character of capitalist social relations, right? So the idea that the national bourgeoisie was a potential destroyer of the national liberation project is like, of course it was, because what else would happen with national liberation in a world of globally mobile capital investment? And my hearkening back to the importance of the United States in establishing this order of national self-determination is important in that regard, because from the outset, the United States in particular well understood that national sovereignty would lead to a growing power of capital, right? So for Fanon, to, 1941 Atlantic Charter, for Fanon to not understand that by the 1960s is actually quite shocking, right? And is evidence of the nationalist occupation of liberation imaginations, right? So I do think that the neo-colonial thesis that Eric Williams and many others fell into provided an alibi for national liberation, right? That the problem was always these outside forces that were preventing the nation from true liberation. And that continues to be the basis for anti-migrant violence, right? That the foreigners are still hindering the project. So I'm not sure if that completely answers your question. And I would love to read those essays that you referenced on migration within the Bolsheviks. I haven't read them, so I can't really attend to them, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that, because that's super fascinating. And of course, the Bolsheviks are, operating within a framework in which nationalism is already nipping at the heels of world revolution, right? So I would love to hear your thoughts on that. So I don't know if Radhika.
Thank you. Likewise, I too would like to see the essays that you referenced, because that would be fascinating to look at. But in terms of your first question around, was there another path available in anti-colonial thinking? Again, someone like Fanon has a deep ambivalence towards nationalism, right? He kind of needs to go through the nation to get to the international. But at least in Wretched of the Earth, I mean, there's, he's kind of both bound by the moment of the Algerian struggle and can see the limitations in his own thought, right? So I read that text as trying to grasp toward something else, as do several other people. There were also, just thinking about the moments I'm describing, particularly in the early 19th century, loads of Indian revolutionaries floating around the world, concerned with migration and concerned with the lack of the promise of liberal equality coming to fruition. So part also of this whole Kamagata Maru ship was that there were these militant revolutionaries on board who were advocating, unlike Gandhi, for the violent overthrow of British colonialism in India, because they, so on the journey back to India, as the ship was made to leave, they stopped in, I believe, Hong Kong, and gathered a bunch of guns. And they were working in consort with revolutionaries on the west coast of the United States. Revolutionaries in Berlin were in touch with the Irish revolutionaries. So a huge lot of ferment of, very exciting revolutionary thought. But they too kind of got trapped into national thinking. Gandhi too, who spent 20 years in South Africa as an immigrant, and arguably one can say that his thinking around questions of nationalism were formed because of the discriminations he faced there. And indeed, Hind Swaraj, his sort of manifesto for anti-colonial nationalism, was written when he was on a return journey back from England to South Africa after trying to appeal to the imperial government to not allow certain immigration-related legislation in South Africa. And he failed in that, So he's sort of coming to this national resolution. So I guess it does become like the national resolution to the migration question. We just find that repeatedly, that I guess, if the horizon of people's thinking was the empire, the way to break through that horizon seemed to be national thinking, despite deep ambivalences around it. And here I think it's important to keep in mind how even some of both revolutionary and simultaneously not revolutionary enough thinkers like Gandhi or a Fanon, and I know many people would be angry that I call them not revolutionary enough, but they did all call for this notion of a new man, right? Whether it's Césaire, it's Fanon, it's Gandhi, even Mao, everyone is sort of trying to edge toward this new, radically new political subjectivity. So I think actually that is one of the afterlives of colonialism that I wish we could resurrect, sort of this ferment of thinking about a new political subjectivity.
So I guess we don't really have time for another round of questions because in 15 minutes we will start with the Marxism panel. What do you think? Should we have another round? Or how many questions do we have? So we have Emma. So maybe we go with those two and then wrap it up. Okay. Emma, do you want to go? Oh, you have the mic.
Hello, thank you so much, both of you. I'm a big fan of your work. I actually have, two brief questions. One to Professor Sharma. I think that, I don't think you're being totally unfair to Patrick Wolf, but in his final book, Traces of History, he does, in a way, include the logic of racism and racialization as a pivotal element in settler colonialism, in the logic of settler colonialism, particularly when he talks about how following an ideal type of the US as a settler colony, how there was a different racialization of blood regarding of the blood quantum for Native Americans, and of course the one-drop rule for for blacks. And then how even he includes the issue of assimilation, forced assimilation, particularly in the case of Israel regarding Mizrahim, Sephardi, and then Russian Jews. And I think it's quite, he died, so we don't know how his thought would have been evolved, but I think that he was very much influenced by both of you and others in order to realize his limitations in his just very binary logic of settler colonialism. And I want to push you, Professor Mongia, regarding Andrea's point, because to include perhaps what Adam Getachew and Frederick Cooper have talked about, the federation perhaps in the Franco-African Federation post-World War II, and even Eric Williams' project in as a Anglo-Caribbean Federation in Trinidad and Tobago, that of course both of them failed, but as possible, if not path not taken, alternatives that because of the Cold War or other factors eventually were doomed. Thank you.
Thanks. My name is Alexei. Thank you very much for your talks. And I have a question that basically addresses my own ignorance to Professor Sharma. So your account was, as far as I understood, a critical one. Does it come with suggestions regarding the forms of political collective organizations, because one of the features of the nation state was popular sovereignty and particular kind of access to political agency. How would it look in a non-citizen or anti-citizen world? Would anarchist models and thinking be helpful in this regard, or something else? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I haven't actually read that last book by Patrick Wolf, so I'm ignorant about that, but I should read it. He just kind of makes my head explode, so it's I have to brace myself. But I think that he's, you're absolutely correct in the way that you're describing his argument, right? That in the United States, there were different racist projects as they applied to people that the U.S. classified as Indians and people that they classified as Blacks, right? Though there were different racist strategies to contain both sets of groups. But I think that where Patrick Wolf falls apart, because this seems to be kind of similar to his previous work, is that there's no distinction made between the practices of the state and alternative ways of undoing those, like the practices needed to undo those, right? So he maintains the categories of Native and Black as distinct and separate categories rather than the political project being to collapse those categories, right? Which would be my political project, right? Is the rejection of those categories and the construction of these new ways of thinking and being in the world, right? So I think that's, like, I think, for example, I'm thinking a lot about this concept of even white settler colonialism. Like, I know that Patrick Wolf takes the whiteness out of settler colonialism, which I think is extremely problematic. But even the term white settler colonialism is, again, a project from above, right? It's a project of imperial states to divide people from one another so that those who are categorized as white feel that they have an investment in maintaining their whiteness against the non-whiteness of others, right? Rather than, like, there are politically, the project should be to end whiteness. And in the project of ending whiteness, we need to see how people in Europe also were expropriated from land and also had their labor exploited and also faced enormous denigration until they were captured in this category of whiteness, right? So to bring Europe back into the conversation about colonialism and anti-colonialism, and not just as perpetrators, but also as victims, right? Not just this uniform category of European, I think is crucial. In terms of alternative projects, definitely I would say that anarchism is a political project that can undo the nationalisms of the anti-colonial projects that have failed. But then again, as anarchists, it's we're not necessarily very programmatic, right? In the sense of I think what is necessary, like, I take a lot of inspiration from, for example, no borders movements or border abolitionist movements along the Mediterranean right now, right? The Mediterranean and the Aegean, precisely because they began as we need to enact migrant justice, and now it's we need to end citizenship, right? So there is an understanding that the entire world needs to be transformed, and there needs to be a different basis for laying claim to land, right? There needs to be kind of a deterritorialization project, so we no longer imagine that some people have control over land that gets turned into territory, and that we return to a politics of land, right? And return to a different basis for laying claim to it that's not based on nativeness or nationness, right? And that again goes back to the Commons, which is a very early anti-capitalist, anti-colonial project, right? Is the Commons. So there's just a much more, I think, political resonance to a demand for the Commons today than there was certainly 50 years ago, certainly 25 years ago. Like the resurgence of the Commons, I think, is where the political work needs to be done. And I think this is actually going back to an earlier comment of Vanessa's, right, where it is in the absence that is very sorely felt, extremely dangerous absence of an anti-capitalist project that is not nationalist, right? That is a very, very dangerous absence in our world right now. That, like, how do we deal with the growing intensification of state violence, right? And the growing capture of more and more of our lives under capitalism when we don't have a social movement to look to and be part of that is capable of ending that rather than containing it through national liberation, right? I think that is honestly the project I think we should all be engaged in building.
I'll be brief because I know everyone needs a break. So I agree with you that there were alternative imaginaries, and unfortunately, they didn't come to pass. And I think it's important that we, I'm someone who is very who configures her work around genealogy as opposed to teleology. So those moments would be very, very key to seeing how one path was taken and not the other, right? And why certain projects failed, just to alert us to the contingency of our present as opposed to its naturalness. And I'll leave it at that.
All right.